That flurry of angry lights is one of many synergized builds you can make in this bite-sized action RPG roguelite called Hellclock. Hellclock brings fast-paced combat through a repeating dungeon that seems simple at first glance, but before long you'll be developing new strategies with each new unlock. This ARPG was developed by Rogue Snail and published by Mad Mushroom. Hellclock released in July 2025, but has received updates since then, and more on the way to expand its endgame content. But without further ado, let's get to the review. I'll admit that I wasn't as interested in this game at first glance, primarily because it was a roguelite, which usually isn't my jam. However, the content the game covered did catch my attention, and ultimately made me want to give the game a chance. Hellclock, as told on the Steam page, is inspired by the Brazilian historical event known as the War of Canudos. As a history buff, someone who likes learning about other cultures, and someone who especially likes learning about things not usually showcased in popular media, this was the perfect matchup for me. Anyway, for those who don't know, and as far as I understand it, the War of Canudos was essentially a massacre. The newly formed Brazilian Republic seemed to have felt threatened by Antonio Conselheiro and his followers, who I guess were labeled as monarchists. Either way, they posed little threat to the nascent government, but despite this were met with fierce and violent conflict. The people of Canudos, despite their lack of arms and training, managed to fend off 3 military expeditions sent by the government. However, in the 4th, the village was bombarded by artillery, and pretty much everyone was slaughtered, with a death toll of around 30,000 by some estimates.
Sangue, com seu ouro, seu ferro e seu fogo, banharam Monte Santo com o sangue do trabalhador sertanejo. Mesmo os velhos, mulheres e crianças.
In Hellclock you play as Pajeu, a Canudos fighter and one of the leaders. However, the game takes place in the aftermath of the events. Instead, Pajeu finds himself fighting through, well, I assume hell given the name of the game. He's searching for the lost soul of Conselheiro, and throughout this search he comes across other demons of his past, being significant figures who played a role in Canudos' destruction. For each of these encounters, players are greeted with well-illustrated, comic book-like cutscenes that provide a bit more context. However, I'll admit that I didn't quite understand everything about the overall story. It's partially due to the way the game doles out its story, as it's sparse and kind of vague, although I imagine a part of this is probably because I'm not well versed enough in Brazilian history. If it had been on something I'd been more familiar with, then I'm sure this wouldn't be as much of an issue. I do wish the game provided a bit more backstory or context for those unfamiliar with the event, but I understand this event is probably well known for Brazilians, so it might be a similar situation like putting extra context for the American Civil War for Americans. Bottom line, I appreciated the exposure to something I never heard of before. There's certainly enough here to pique someone's interest in the event, and I think that's incredibly important. One of the major reasons why I have an interest in history is because of playing the original Age of Empires, real-time strategy, as a kid. It didn't really go that in-depth on any particular events, even with the history section on each scenario, but it was enough to spark an interest to learn more. I also like the fact that the game featured Brazilian Portuguese voice acting, which I happily chose to play with over the English. I will say that it was a bit hard to follow sometimes in the middle of the action, as I needed to read the subtitles since I don't know any Portuguese. But I like it when games have that added level of immersion. Speaking of, I quite enjoyed the music for the game. While I don't know much about Brazilian music, it did sound very authentic and fitting for my treks into hell.
Compadre Abade, corra! Salve sua vida!
What Hellclock essentially does is boil down an action RPG experience into a bite-sized roguelite run. This means that while you do have incremental progression in between runs, any gains you make during a run, like skill upgrades or stat boosts, only exist within that current run. Runs can start off short, being about 10 minutes, but by the end I had runs that could be a bit over half an hour. Obviously, this can come down to your current build and skill using it, so if you die too soon, then your run obviously ends. However, more often than not, my runs ended because of the titular Hellclock. This is essentially an arbitrary timer that ticks down until you get ejected from your run. At first I wasn't sure if I'd like this, but I quickly came to enjoy the process of seeing how far I could get in subsequent runs. There are passives that can extend the clock, and some things within a run that can extend the timer as well. Obviously, upgrades you make for your build will also see you performing better in a run. Although, if you're absolutely against this mechanic, then the game does offer a mode where you don't have to play with the timer. Additionally, they also have an easier mode, called Vengeance Mode, for those who don't really want to think about build crafting at all. I'd recommend at least starting on normal though. I found myself having minimal problems, save for a couple of moments, and I wouldn't call myself an expert build crafter. Also, for the record, all my thoughts are largely based off of a normal playthrough, as I didn't play on veteran difficulty at all. Throughout a run, the player has to cut down hordes of enemies on each level, all the while collecting trinkets, purchasing blessings, and gathering new relics and gear. Trinkets are passive stat boosts that are essentially completely random. They get hoovered up instantly when passing over them, and I didn't really see much strategy surrounding them. You either get them or you don't. There are passives to improve the trinket drop rate, but that's really it. Blessings, on the other hand, have more choice behind them. Every time you level up, you'll gain a blessing to augment one of your abilities. And at the end of a level, you'll be able to purchase a blessing to passively improve a stat. These choices can improve your damage, reduce your cooldowns, and other passive buffs. Finally, you can also receive gear and relics. Gear is fairly straightforward. They just act as more passive buffs for your build. However, relics are slightly more nuanced and are the bread and butter of your build. Or maybe just the butter part, since you need active skills for any of this to matter. So before I get to that, let me go over the active skills really quickly. At the start, your skills are limited, but with each act you finish, then you get a new set of skills to swap out on your bar. So by the end, you'll have a bunch of skills to mix and match and create unique playstyles. But as these possibilities grow, so too does the complexity of each build because of the relics you gather from your runs. Anyway, these relics can just provide passive buffs, like everything else. However, the more unique relics can augment your active skills. And some of them can augment the skills substantially so they act completely different, which is really cool when you figure out how to click certain relics and skills together. My first build where everything clicked, I used the spinning double blades and augmented them with lifesteal and the ability to still move when using the skill. It served me well and carried me through the first act and most of the second act. However, once I got a few relics for the Holy Rosary and this guard summon skill, I was able to go crazy with this yellow barrage you see on screen. That was such an aha moment, and it was cool that the game let me figure this out on my own. However, it was after this that my experimenting kind of ended though, and that was mainly because the game never really threw any curveballs my way, forcing me to drastically change things. Instead, most of my modifications to my build were incremental. I swapped out a relic here or slotted out a different skill, but for the most part the gameplay of what I set myself on was still the same, a flurry of yellow death. Although that being said, the game does say in the loading screen tip that boss fights shouldn't take a long time, and that the game shouldn't feel grindy. So if those things are happening, then it probably means you need to change your build. Except, the game doesn't really do much in the way of letting you know why your build isn't working. The biggest problem is the game's inability to convey information to the player. There are various elemental resistances in the game, but since I never knew what killed me, I never knew what resistances to build up. The same thing could be said for enemies' weaknesses, if they had any, and explanation for a lot of the different stats. Although for the latter, there was a bit of explanation by going onto the character screen and highlighting over the different stats to get a description. Some of the mechanics aren't really well explained either, such as me not knowing I could level up or down my active skills until I was in Act 3. Although, I guess that goes to show how effective my build was, or more than likely how easy normal difficulty was, since all my skills had been at level 1 up until that point. Then there was the moment-to-moment action itself. While yes, it certainly is flashy and is pretty cool when you're spawning a barrage of colorful destruction, it doesn't lend itself well to the player in figuring out what the heck is going on. A lot of the time, it was essentially impossible for me to read what was happening on screen, and I couldn't determine what were my skills popping off and what were the enemies. Sometimes it was even difficult to see where my character was. The only real indication I had was to move if I started to see my health drop. The problem with this is that it could be easy for something to hit you that could drop you from full health to 0 rather quickly. But essentially all I could do is just skill spam and hope it obliterated everything on screen, which usually did the job. I think the biggest thing I'd like to see in the game is a way to save relic and skill loadouts. I had saved some other relics with the intent of experimenting, but it got to a point where I didn't want to completely change up what I had for fear of forgetting what I had slotted in the first place, since you couldn't save a loadout. Added to the struggle of creating a build was the fact that there were no search options for relics you had stored in your reliquary. It would have been nice to search for relics that affected certain active skills, or maybe search for specific passives, like something that affected lightning damage or improving critical chance. Instead, you have to highlight every single relic in your inventory to check, and eventually I just couldn't be bothered. I started selling anything that wasn't directly related to my current build. Like any good action RPG, when you beat the game, then the endgame opens up. In Hellclock, this essentially means a new game plus, and a new roguelite mode called Ascension. So first off, this isn't an early access title, but the endgame is still in development as of this writing. There were even placeholder options in the Ascension mode. That said, from the dev updates, it sounds like they're working hard on new content, and even addressing some of the aforementioned issues I had with buildcrafting. Anyway, normally this would be the part of an ARPG where I dip out, but I was genuinely having fun with the game, so I decided to push further and check out these additional modes. As for the new game plus, it comes in 2 more difficulties, I guess? Although not exactly, because I was still playing on regular. Whatever you want to call them, there is Abyss and Oblivion. You have to beat Act 3 in Abyss first before unlocking Oblivion, and that was relatively easy to do despite the supposed added challenge. However, Oblivion ups the ante, and yeah, you're probably going to need to have an actual understanding of builds and different relics in order to clear it. I attempted the first boss and lost on 3 separate occasions, despite blasting through every boss on the Abyss setting on the first try. But because of the, once again, aforementioned buildcrafting issues, I decided it wasn't worth it to me. I did try out Ascension mode, which is essentially the same game, but you have all your skills unlocked from the get-go. Additionally, you have to purchase debuffs with every Ascension you make, which makes the enemies a bit tougher. You have a set number of runs per Ascension, and if you run out of runs, then I don't know. I guess you have to ascend probably to get new runs, but then also more debuffs, which doesn't seem to make sense. I don't really know since it wasn't explained that well, and the mode itself is still in construction. After running the first 2 action Ascension, I essentially decided that I had my fill and was done. One last thing to note, which is related to the growing fatigue I had with the game, was the levels are essentially the same every time you run them. There didn't seem to be any sort of randomization at all to the level layouts, which struck me as a bit weird since that seems to be a primary staple to the roguelite genre. I suppose, in the end, it wouldn't matter that much since, visually, the levels would look the same regardless as if they were randomly generated or handcrafted levels. However, level design wise, I began to recognize layouts after running them again and again. And that brings us to my final thoughts, but first, if you're enjoying the video or found it helpful, then please consider giving this video a like and subscribing for more video game coverage in the future in the form of reviews and first impressions. And hey, if you happen to be watching this video in the first week of its release, then I'd be super appreciative if you could hit that hype button as well, which is a new feature YouTube put out there to help smaller creators get seen. Hellclock runs for $19.99 USD, and I put around 22 hours in the game. I'm a bit mixed as to whether or not I'd say it's worth it at that price. For someone like me, I'm a person who would finish the main campaign of an action RPG and probably not play too much past that. so essentially that time would be under 20 hours, which isn't worth it to me. That said, I think the typical ARPG player is someone who grinds in the endgame to try and unlock everything, refine their builds, and take on the game's toughest challenges. As for that kind of player, I think there is some of that present. However, at the same time, the endgame is still technically in development, so it's hard to say how exactly it will be by the end of it though. I do think the dev team will deliver on what they want to make, which, I mean, it's already largely there as is. Furthermore, they have a planned story DLC that expands with a 4th act that could be really interesting, and of course add more content. I'd also say that if you want to support something different in terms of the blend of gameplay they're shooting for, but also just the subject matter that inspired this dev team, then I think Hellclock is worthy of that support. I certainly had fun playing this game, and I feel better off for it now knowing a little bit more about the world around me. If you played the game, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't, then let me know if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, or if you have any other questions. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.